In year 1918 at Yorkshire, England, an architect arrives at a large manor house with his wife. He thinks to himself how perfect it looks and was shocked for the price was very low compared to the beauty that stood before them. He shares his thoughts with his wife and she agrees. They are both very much excited to buy the house. Mr. Bradley, the manager of the house, greets them. He discusses the terms and conditions for the house and how the owner, Mr. Peter Dawson, is very much happy to get his hands off of the house finally. Curious, Jacob asks him why would anyone want to get rid of such a beautiful house. Mr. Bradley was reluctant in replying but finally gave in and said, "It's because the owner thinks it's haunted, though he himself has never experienced anything out of normal, and he has been in the house for numerous occasions." On hearing this, Jacob laughs and shakes his head. But his wife Elena just looked back at the house. It was a rough beginning for both Jacob and Elena. Their family never approved their relationship. The reason for it was because Jacob belonged to a strictly Jewish family, and Elena belonged to a strictly Christian family. When they both told about their relationship to their family, they were enraged. Elena's family disowned her immediately. Even though Jacob's family tried to tell him how this was a bad idea, they also tried killing Elena on numerous occasions. Jacob had had enough and finally disowned them himself. Jacob and Elena decided they didn't want anybody in their life and they would start their life in different town away from their respective families. They held their own little ceremony and got married. Jacob was an architect and Elena, a teacher. Jacob requested his boss for his job to be transferred to another town. His boss was delighted because he had gotten a new project in Yorkshire and Jacob would fit in perfectly. Elena quit her job and said she would start new, which currently brings them here. Mr. Bradley welcomes them in the house. As soon as Elena steps in, she starts to feel weird, though she couldn't tell why. Jacob looks around the house with Mr. Bradley accompanying him. Mr. Bradley gives them a short tour and leaves the couple, telling them they can contact him again if they had any questions. The couple try to settle in the house. The house was already well furnished. They would just replace things that they thought needed replacement or would just buy some new stuff to decorate the house even more. The house was fashioned in Old English style and they wanted to keep it just like that. The house consisted of living room, dining room, drawing room, a grand kitchen, a guest room with a bathroom. In middle stood a very beautiful elegant grand staircase that led to the upper portion of the house. The upper portion consisted of 5 big rooms including a master bedroom and 2 bathrooms. First month in the house goes beautifully as the couple settle in. Elena would occasionally feel weird things but she just shrugged it off, thinking it's just the new feeling of the house. Occasionally, she would feel cold wind pass by her or cold wind just hitting her feet leaving her freezing. She thought it must be the chill air coming by the window. Even though she would close the window, she could still sometimes feel it. She even heard whispers in the house but couldn't exactly make out what they were. Occasionally though, she would hear the name Maggie being whispered in a gravely man voice. It would seem to her as though someone is whispering it only to her. She tried telling Jacob, but she thought it sounded stupid and Jacob would just laugh at her. Neither of them were religious despite their background, and always talked about the beliefs their family believed and would often just look at each other and laugh till their stomachs ached. One night as they were sleeping, Elena woke up by the whisper of the name Maggie again. She sat up thinking, did it really happen or was she just dreaming? But she heard it again and she quickly turned to her husband and woke him up. She told him what she heard and asked if he heard it too. He said no. He said it's probably just a dream or it could be the whispers of the wind hitting the windows. Elena did not agree. But she just held on to her husband and slept in. Over the time, the feelings just grew stronger and she couldn't ignore it anymore. She would try telling Jacob again, she thought. Just then she heard a cry. It sounded like that of an injured man. It came from the drawing room. She walked towards the room she thought she heard it from. She opened the door. There was a large portrait of a beautiful lady. It almost covered the whole wall. She looked around, there was no one in the room. She studied the portrait with peculiar interest. There also was a piano on one side of the room accompanied with a chair. They still hadn't gotten around to that room yet. Everything in that room was very old and dusty. There was white sheet of cloth draped over the piano but you could see the piano peeking as the cloth was not properly draped. She righted the cloth and walked towards the door to leave the room. As she touched the lock of the door, she heard the piano play by itself. She turned immediately, startled, shocked, frightened. There wasn't much furniture in that room so she could see till the very end of the room. There was no one in the room beside her. No one, not even a single shadow. She left the room immediately. She started pacing and was waiting for Jacob so she could tell him what she just witnessed. There was no way she could ignore this. She waited for a long time and soon got tired of waiting. She just sat on her armchair and decided to rest, and she fell asleep. When Jacob arrived, he noticed her sleeping on the armchair. He went to wake her up. Her skin felt really hot when he touched her. Her temperature had risen very much. He gently woke her up. She very weakly opened her eyes. He picked her up and took her to their bedroom and laid her on the bed. She tried talking to him, but she was unable to get a word out. She felt very weak. Jacob looked at her worryingly. He thought he should get her checked by a doctor. He calls for the keeper of the house, who is a very old man, and told him to get a nearby doctor as fast as he can. The housekeeper stares at Elena not moving. Annoyed, Jacob tells him to hurry. Housekeeper snatches out of his stance, rushes out of the door. The doctor arrives, checks her conditions. The doctor looks really worried. He says he has never seen anyone be this ill before. He gives some medicine for Elena and tells Jacob to follow the prescriptions and give them every day. Days pass by. Jacob takes care of Elena like a devoted husband, but Elena shows no sign of improvement. Her skin still feels extremely hot to touch. He becomes extremely worried. He has already contacted 3 physicians and none of them were of any help. The housekeeper sees how restless Jacob is. He goes up to him and hesitantly says that it's probably something because of the presence in the house. Jacob, already worried, says he has no time for such stories right now. But the housekeeper insists he listen to him. He says the previous house owner is hiding something and that he should go pay him a visit. He also reminds him of what Mr. Bradley has said about this house when asked about the price of the house. Jacob, seeing how he tried everything, agrees to meet Mr. Bradley. When he asked Mr. Bradley what's going on with the house, Mr. Bradley was unwilling to answer. Jacob could see he was hiding something. Jacob threatens him if he didn't answer his questions, he will not spare him. Frightened, Bradley gives in. He says there is something wrong with the house. The previous owner, Mr. Peter Dawson, also felt some weird presence. It was as if someone was living there and whoever it was didn't want anybody there. More than one occasions Mr. Dawson had felt as though somebody tried killing him. He thought better of it and decided to leave the house and to sell it. The previous owner inherited it from his grandfather. Mr. Bradley said that's all he knows about the house. If he wants to know more, he should personally go meet Mr. Dawson. Jacob asks for the address and leaves to visit Peter. He asks Peter the same thing. He explains how his wife is extremely ill and he'll take any help he can get. Peter looks him in the eye and decides he should know. He asks him to take a seat as it was going to be a long story. And so Peter begins. It all started in 1855. He used to live with his grandfather at the mansion along with his Aunt Maggie, who was his grandfather's daughter. His parents had passed away in a boat accident. His grandfather was the head of CID those days. He was working on a really intense case. He was looking for a man named Robert Clark who worked for some criminal organization. He wrote a letter to Aunt Maggie explaining he would be staying at his friend's house for a few days since it is much closer to the police station, and his presence was often required at the station. Aunt Maggie knew about the case her father was working on. So it was just Peter, his Aunt Maggie, and the gardener. One particular night, his Aunt Maggie and Peter heard a far-off cry of a man, coming from the woods, behind the mansion. Aunt Maggie and Peter took a lighted lamp and went to investigate the source of the cry. Upon reaching somewhere in the woods, they saw a broken cart. They approached it and saw there was an injured man. He looked very much in pain and was unable to move. Aunt Maggie told Peter to get the gardener as fast as he can while she stayed with the stranger. Peter explained the situation to the gardener and they hurried back to where he left his aunt. With the gardener's help, they got the stranger to the mansion. He had injured his back and his leg. He also sprained his ankle. His Aunt Maggie and the gardener helped the stranger heal his wounds. She allowed the stranger to stay at the mansion till he was fully recovered. The stranger introduced himself as Oliver Addison and was very thankful for Aunt Maggie's help. His Aunt Maggie would attend the stranger every day to check up on him. Aunt Maggie, who didn't really have anyone to spend time with, would spend most of her time with Oliver and chat for hours. He told her he was a writer and he traveled often to get ideas for his work. The stranger soon fell in love with his aunt. When he was half recovered and could sit up on his own, he confessed his love to Aunt Maggie. Aunt Maggie was reluctant. She didn't have such feelings for the stranger. She was only helping him out of kindness. She didn't want to break his heart, so she didn't say anything. She simply nodded and left the room. After that, she asked the gardener to take care of him. Her visits were limited to the stranger's room. The stranger was close to recovery and in about a day or two he was to leave the mansion and to be about his life. One late night, Aunt Maggie got really thirsty. So she went to kitchen to get herself a glass of water. That's when she saw something move out of the kitchen window. She went closer to take a good look. She saw the moving figure was none other than Mr. Addison himself, crippled with the same bandage she had dressed him. She sneaked out of the house and followed him. He stopped at a certain spot. Then two well-dressed men approached Mr. Addison. She couldn't see the men very clearly for it was really dark. She allowed to push herself much closer to at least get a snippet of what they were talking about. She couldn't really make much out of it, but she was sure she heard the name Robert Clark. She was startled. That's the name of the man her father was working on a case about. Aunt Maggie quickly sneaked back to the mansion and went to her room. She wrote a letter to her father stating what has happened and to quickly return with his men. She woke up early morning and asked the gardener to post the letter. Meanwhile, she would find a way to stop the stranger from leaving the mansion. The only way she could come up with was pretending to fall in love with the stranger. It worked as Oliver was very much happy to have finally received her love. He agreed to stay back for a day or two to spend more time with Aunt Maggie. Those were the best days of his life. The two were inseparable. He no longer slept in guest room. Aunt Maggie would tell him her ridiculous childhood stories, making him laugh till his sides ached. He had never had a good laugh ever since he was a kid. She would bake him his favorite blueberry muffins. Every evening she'd play piano for him. He would sit there listening to her for hours. She stitched him a scarf with his name embroidered on it. He couldn't wait for the future that lay ahead for them. It was pure bliss. The next night as they were preparing for bed, her father barged in with his men and caught Oliver by surprise. Her father reveals that he is no Oliver Addison, but Robert Clark himself. He was shocked, and that's when he knew it was all planned by his own lover Maggie. They took him into custody. But before leaving, he asked Aunt Maggie, was it real? She simply looked away, giving him no answer, and yet he got his answer. Since it was late at night, they kept him locked in the drawing room bound to the piano chair. He committed suicide that night. Aunt Maggie was traumatized by all that had happened. Her father, along with Peter, took her to his sister's house and they spent their lives there. Aunt Maggie never fell in love, nor did she marry. She died on 20th of December, 1894. Upon hearing this, Jacob is shocked. He says it is the same date and year Elena was born. Peter gets funny look on his face, and hesitantly says maybe his Aunt Maggie had a rebirth and has come back into the world in form of Elena. He says there is no doubt the spirit in the mansion is of Robert Clark. Peter now knows why Jacob and Elena were only couple who have survived in the mansion for this long. The spirit has been waiting for Elena all this time. Jacob gets a sudden urge to be by the side of his wife. He asks Peter if there is anything more that he needs to know. Peter says if he finds out about anything, he will let him know, and Jacob leaves for his wife. It was really late when Jacob arrived at the mansion. Upon his arrival, the keeper rushes to Jacob saying Elena is acting weird. Jacob goes to his bedroom with the keeper at his heels to take a look, but Elena was not there. He searches the whole mansion, but she was nowhere to be seen. He asks the keeper if there is any secret room or anything of that sort. The keeper says there is a secret back door that's kept locked for years, and no one has ever used it. It leads to the back of the mansion. The keeper says he does not have the keys for that door. Regardless, Jacob asks the keeper to lead him to that door. They find the door and it is kept ajar. They exchange glances and open the door that led them into the woods of a very chilly night. They keep looking around, and not far away, they spot Elena curled up with her head bent on her knees, slowly rocking. He approaches her and calls out her name. She does not respond. He bends over and touches her. She starts at his touch and is looking at him as if she has no idea who he is. He calls out her name once again and she seemed to come back, for she realizes where she is, and has no idea how she reached there. Jacob notices she was wearing the scarf embroidered Oliver on it. The scarf Peter mentioned. He helps her back into the mansion and tucks her to bed. Jacob did not sleep the whole night. He somehow dozed in the early morning and only woke up when the keeper woke him up. He saw Elena is back to being sick and her skin is again very much hot to the touch. He couldn't understand. He told the keeper last night Elena was so cold, it was as though he was touching a body from grave. Elena still had the scarf of Oliver. The keeper suggested they get the nearby priest involved. Jacob agreed. He calls for the priest and it will take a day for the priest to arrive at the mansion. That evening Jacob again notices Elena is not in the bed, but in the drawing room playing piano. Elena never knew how to play piano. Jacob hesitantly approaches Elena and tries to get her off, but she scowled at him fiercely. He has never seen Elena like that before. He knew then she is definitely possessed. She was wearing the scarf around her neck. He tried to get it off her sneakily but failed. For she noticed and scored him across his face. It would leave a very angry mark. Jacob thought it best to let her be but also kept a close eye on her. Jacob noticed that night Elena sneaked out of the mansion through the back door and went into the woods, curled into the same position as he had found her before. She sat there slowly rocking for hours. As dawn approached, she went back to bed as how he had tucked her. Jacob was very baffled of all that was happening. The next day Priest arrives and Jacob greets him. He asks Priest for tea and sets about telling him about Elena and Maggie and everything in between. Priest says he has got the holy water and to sprinkle it on Elena every evening. Jacob shows the priest the guest room. He did as Priest had told him, but there were no changes. Elena went about the piano the whole evening and also sneaked out just as she had been doing. He told the priest about this. Priest didn't understand what was happening. In the morning he even read some holy verses and placed the cross overhead, but to no avail. They tried everything they could think of. None of it was of any use. Days went by and there was no changes, no improvement. Soon even the priest was of no help. Elena was sick and hot by day, cold and biting by the evening. He was practically living with a ghost. That evening as he sat staring at Elena who was playing piano, it struck to him it was the scarf and the piano. He should get rid of them. And he needs to get rid of them in the evening. But he had to find a way to get the scarf away from Elena. He thought of doing the only thing he could think of. He approached Elena. He asked if she would like to have something. She didn't answer. He asked if he could get her favorite pancakes with maple syrup and honey. Again no answer. He then asked if he could get her blueberry muffins. She looked at him as though someone snatched her head. Her pale white face, lit up and with a ghostly smile, she nodded vigorously. He set about making the blueberry muffins with the help of Keeper and he made plenty. He got them for her. As soon as she smelled them she devoured at them like a savage animal who has been kept hungry for days. He slowly sneaked behind her and got the scarf. She was busy devouring the muffins. He placed the scarf on piano and set the piano on fire. Elena jumped at this sudden action. She screeched highly and tried to get in the fire. Jacob quickly held her from behind. The whole time the scarf and piano was burning, she let out a very devastating gravely scream coming from somewhere very deep inside of her. At last he threw the muffins in fire too. Elena was powerless, exhausted and fell to floor limping, motionless, lifeless. He held her for what seemed like for hours. He rubbed her not-so-cold hands that were beginning to get warm slowly. She stirred a little and let out a breath. She opened her eyes slowly. Jacob for the first time felt relief. He could see plain as day it was his wife. She looked around confused, asked him what happened. Jacob asked her if she remembered anything. She said she got tired of waiting for him and fell asleep on the armchair. He just stared at her and slowly chuckled. She asked him what's going on and he says it's a story for another time. For now they gotta clear the mess. For the next few days they get rid of all the stuff that is of Maggie and renovates the house. He tells her all that has happened and Elena doesn't remember any of it. There is no sign of anything out of normal. They have fallen into a very normal life pattern. Years pass by, and they give birth to 3 wonderful kids. 2 boys, David and Jack, and a lovely girl, Maggie. And they all lived happily in the mansion. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more.